The small town of Millbrook, Alabama, had always been a place where everyone knew their neighbors and secrets were hard to keep. But in the summer of 1938, a mystery unfolded that would haunt the community for generations. A young woman named Alina Grace Whitfield disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a family desperate for answers, and a town gripped by fear and suspicion. Alina was 23 years old when she vanished on a humid June evening. She had been working at the local textile mill and was known throughout Millbrook as a kind and gentle soul who sang in the church choir every Sunday. Her auburn hair and bright smile were familiar sights on Main Street, where she would often stop to chat with shopkeepers and neighbors. On that fateful day, she told her mother she was walking to the general store to pick up some fabric for a dress she was making. She never returned home. When Alina failed to come back by nightfall, her parents, Thomas and Martha Whitfield, became frantic. Thomas immediately gathered a group of men from the neighborhood, and they searched the streets with lanterns, calling out her name into the darkness. The general store owner confirmed that Alina had never arrived at his shop that evening. Her planned route was only half a mile from her home, along a well-traveled road, but somewhere along that short journey she had simply vanished. The local sheriff, Henry Caldwell, launched an investigation the very next morning. Deputies combed through the woods surrounding the town and dragged the nearby creek, searching for any sign of the missing woman. They questioned everyone who lived along the route Alina would have taken, but nobody reported seeing anything unusual. It was as if she had been plucked from the earth by invisible hands. The community rallied together, organizing search parties that scoured the countryside for weeks, but every lead turned into a dead end. As the investigation continued, suspicion began to fall on several people in the town. There was James Montgomery, a drifter, who had been seen working odd jobs around Millbrook in the weeks before Alina disappeared. He had a reputation for drinking and had been involved in a bar fight just days before the disappearance. Sheriff Caldwell brought him in for questioning multiple times, but Montgomery insisted he knew nothing about what happened to Alina. Without any physical evidence linking him to the crime, the sheriff had no choice but to let him go. Montgomery left town shortly after and was never seen in Millbrook again. Another person of interest was Robert Thorne, a wealthy landowner who lived on the outskirts of town. Several people claimed they had seen Robert watching Alina at church services and around town. His wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and some townsfolk whispered that he had developed an unhealthy obsession with the young woman. Robert vehemently denied any involvement, and his prominent position in the community made him seem like an unlikely suspect. The sheriff questioned him, but without evidence, the investigation could go no further in that direction. The most heartbreaking aspect of the case was the toll it took on the Whitfield family. Martha Whitfield spent years maintaining Alina's bedroom exactly as she had left it, hoping against hope that her daughter would walk through the door one day. Thomas aged rapidly under the weight of not knowing what had happened to his child. The couple spent their life savings hiring private investigators and following up on tips that came from as far away as Tennessee and Georgia. Every lead proved to be false. The Whitfields both passed away in the 1960s, never knowing the truth about their daughter's fate. As the decades rolled by, the case grew cold. The original investigators retired or passed away, and the files were relegated to dusty storage rooms in the county courthouse. New generations grew up in Millbrook hearing whispered stories about the girl who vanished, but the case became more legend than active investigation. Occasionally, a journalist would write an article about the unsolved mystery, or a true crime enthusiast would try to piece together what might have happened, but no new evidence ever emerged. The case might have remained unsolved forever if not for a discovery made in the spring of 2024. A construction crew was demolishing an old abandoned house on the far edge of Millbrook to make way for a new development. The house had belonged to the Thorne family and had sat empty for decades after the last of the Thornes moved away in the 1970s. As workers tore into the basement, they made a grisly discovery. Hidden behind a false wall in the cellar, they found human remains wrapped in deteriorated fabric and buried in a shallow grave. The local police immediately contacted the State Bureau of Investigation, and forensic anthropologists were brought in to examine the remains. The bones were determined to be those of a young woman who had died sometime in the late 1930s. Scraps of fabric found with the remains matched the style of clothing worn during that era. The skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, suggesting the victim had been murdered. Investigators carefully documented everything and collected samples for DNA analysis. The discovery sent shockwaves through Millbrook. Elderly residents who remembered the original case immediately wondered if these could be the remains of Alina Whitfield. The problem was that Alina had no living direct descendants, and her parents had been buried decades ago. However, genealogists working with the investigation team were able to track down a distant cousin living in Mobile who agreed to provide a DNA sample. The wait for results seemed to take forever as the community held its collective breath. When the DNA results came back, they confirmed what many had suspected. The remains found in the basement of the old Thorne house were indeed those of Alina Grace Whitfield. After 86 years, the missing woman had finally been found. But the discovery raised even more disturbing questions. How had her body ended up in the Thorne basement, and who had put her there? Investigators began re-examining all the old case files with fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques. They studied property records, birth certificates, and death certificates for everyone connected to the original investigation. What they discovered was shocking. Robert Thorne had died in 1952, but he had a younger brother named William who had been living in the house at the time of Alina's disappearance. William had been only 19 years old in 1938 and had largely escaped scrutiny during the original investigation because attention had been focused on his older brother. Digging deeper into William's background, investigators found disturbing information. He had been expelled from a private school in Montgomery 2 years before Alina's disappearance after a female student accused him of inappropriate behavior. The school had hushed up the incident to avoid scandal, and William had returned to Millbrook to work on his family's land. After Robert Thorne's death, William had inherited the property and lived there alone until 1968 when he suddenly moved to Florida. He died in Miami in 2003, leaving behind a wife and 2 adult children. But the investigation was far from over. Detectives traveled to Florida to interview William's surviving family members. His widow claimed she knew nothing about any connection to a missing person case from Alabama. However, William's son Michael, who was now 62 years old, agreed to speak with investigators. What he told them was stunning. Michael revealed that his father had kept a locked trunk in their attic for as long as he could remember. William had always been secretive about its contents and forbade anyone from touching it. After William's death, the family had simply moved the trunk to a storage unit without ever opening it. Investigators obtained a warrant and opened the trunk. Inside, they found a collection of items that turned their blood cold. There were newspaper clippings about Alina's disappearance meticulously preserved in a scrapbook. There were photographs of Alina that appeared to have been taken without her knowledge, showing her walking to work and attending church. Most damning of all was a diary written in William's handwriting. The entries detailed his growing obsession with Alina and his anger when she rejected his advances at a church social. The final entry, dated June 18, 1938, described how he had followed her on the road that evening and struck her when she refused to speak with him. The diary entry was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. William wrote about panicking after realizing Alina was dead and dragging her body back to his family's house under cover of darkness. He described burying her in the basement and building the false wall to hide the grave. He wrote about attending the search parties and listening to people speculate about what might have happened, all while knowing he was responsible. The diary contained enough specific details about the crime scene and Alina's clothing that investigators were convinced of its authenticity. With this evidence in hand, authorities faced a difficult question. William Thorne was long dead and could not be prosecuted. However, the investigation revealed that Michael Thorne had known about the diary for years. After his father's death, Michael had eventually opened the trunk and read its contents. Rather than coming forward, he had kept the secret hidden, protecting his father's memory and his family's reputation. Under Alabama law, this made Michael an accessory after the fact to murder. In October of 2025, authorities in Mobile arrested Michael Thorne at his suburban home. The arrest shocked the community, where Michael was known as a respected retired banker and grandfather. News of the arrest spread quickly and soon reached Millbrook, where the revelation sent tremors through the town. People who remembered the original case could hardly believe that after all these years, someone was finally being held accountable, even if it was the son rather than the actual murderer. The arrest sparked intense debate in both communities. Some people argued that Michael should not be punished for his father's crimes, and that keeping the secret was understandable given the circumstances. Others insisted that justice for Alina required holding anyone who had obstructed the truth accountable regardless of their relationship to the killer. Legal experts weighed in, noting that while accessory after the fact charges were unusual in cases this old, the evidence against Michael was substantial. Michael's attorney argued that his client had been wrestling with guilt for decades, and that prosecuting an elderly man for protecting his dead father served no purpose. The defense painted a picture of a son torn between loyalty to family and moral responsibility. They pointed out that Michael had cooperated fully once confronted by investigators and had not destroyed the diary or other evidence. The prosecution countered that Michael's silence had denied Alina's family closure for over 20 years after he first learned the truth. They argued that his decision to hide the evidence was a calculated choice that deserved consequences. As the case moved through the legal system, the story captured national attention. True crime documentaries and podcasts devoted episodes to the decades-old mystery and its surprising resolution. Reporters descended on Millbrook, interviewing longtime residents and piecing together memories of that summer in 1938. The old Thorne property, where Alina's remains had been found, became an unwanted landmark, with curious onlookers driving by to see the site where such a terrible secret had been hidden for so long. The few surviving people who had known Alina personally shared their memories with the media. A woman in her 90s who had been Alina's childhood friend spoke tearfully about the kind girl who had loved to read poetry and dream of one day traveling beyond Alabama. A man who had worked alongside Alina at the textile mill remembered her infectious laugh and how she always had an encouraging word for others. These glimpses into who Alina had been helped humanize a woman who had been reduced to a mystery for most of her existence. In March of 2025, Michael Thorne entered a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice in exchange for a sentence of 5 years probation and a substantial fine. The judge acknowledged Michael's age and health issues, but emphasized that his actions had prolonged the suffering of Alina's extended family and the community. Michael read a statement in court apologizing to Alina's descendants and to the people of Millbrook for his role in hiding the truth. Alina Grace Whitfield was finally laid to rest in a proper ceremony in the spring of 2025. The service was held at the same church where she had sung in the choir all those years ago. Dozens of people attended, including distant relatives who had never known her but wanted to honor her memory. The town of Millbrook erected a small memorial in the cemetery, acknowledging the tragedy of her death and the long wait for justice. The resolution of the case brought mixed emotions to Millbrook. There was relief that the mystery had finally been solved and that Alina could be properly buried. But there was also sadness that the truth had taken so long to emerge and that the people who had loved Alina most had died without knowing what happened to her. Some residents expressed anger that William Thorne had lived a full life, while his victim had been hidden in a basement for decades. Others found some solace in knowing that the truth had eventually come to light, even if perfect justice was impossible. The case also prompted discussions about how many other cold cases might be solved with modern technology and renewed investigation. Police departments across the country have thousands of unsolved disappearances and murders from decades past. The Alina Whitfield case demonstrated that even after more than 80 years, it was possible to find answers. Forensic genealogy, DNA analysis, and careful re-examination of old evidence could potentially bring closure to families who had spent lifetimes wondering what happened to their loved ones. For the people of Millbrook, the resolution of Alina's case marked the end of a dark chapter in their town's history. The abandoned Thorne house was demolished, and the land was turned into a small park. Some suggested naming it after Alina, but others felt she deserved to be remembered somewhere more fitting. Eventually, the church where she had sung created a scholarship in her name for young women pursuing education, a tribute to the life and potential that had been stolen from her. The story of Alina Grace Whitfield serves as a reminder that time does not erase the need for justice and truth. Her disappearance in 1938 had seemed destined to remain forever unsolved, just another tragic mystery lost to history. But persistence, modern science, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths eventually revealed what had happened on that June evening so many years ago. While nothing could bring Alina back or undo the decades of secrets and lies, her story finally had an ending, and her memory could be honored properly. The case also highlighted the ripple effects of violence and deception. William Thorne's decision to kill Alina in a moment of rage did not just end one life. It devastated her family, destroyed the peace of an entire community, and ultimately trapped his own son in an impossible moral dilemma. The false wall in that basement had hidden more than just physical remains. It had concealed truth, justice, and the possibility of healing for generations. As the legal proceedings concluded and media attention faded, Millbrook slowly returned to normal life. But the town was changed in subtle ways. Conversations about Alina became less whispered and more open, as if bringing her story into the light had lifted some invisible burden. Younger residents who had only known the case as local legend now understood it as a real tragedy that had touched real lives. The lesson was clear that every cold case represents a person who mattered, a family that deserves answers, and a community that needs truth to heal. The Alina Whitfield case stands as one of the longest solved cold cases in Alabama history. From disappearance in 1938 to resolution in 2025, spans nearly 9 decades of mystery, investigation, heartbreak, and ultimately revelation. It is a testament to the dedication of investigators who refuse to let an old case remain forgotten, and to the power of modern forensic science to reach back through time and uncover truth. Most importantly, it is a reminder that Alina Grace Whitfield was not just a mystery or a headline, but a real person whose life had value, and whose memory deserved justice however long it took to achieve.